I'm the moderator of the panel. I'm Andrew Torgett, and that's the last you'll hear of me because everyone's here to see Justin Martin and his talk about Frederick Law Olmstead's Texas. And so I'm going to give you guys a quick little introduction of Mr. Martin here. His specialty is American history, meticulously researched and delivered in a narrative style that's much akin to fiction. Among his 5 books is Genius of Place, The Life of Frederick Law Olmstead, one of the most colorful characters ever to come through Texas and really in American history writ large. And I will say I got a chance to look at the book. It's an absolutely fabulous book. If you get a chance and you're interested in Olmstead, there's probably there is no better place to go to really understand his life, his legacy, and the larger arc of all of that, how it intersects with American history, than what Justin Martin has written. It's a beautiful piece. Other works that he's done cover subjects ranging from America's first Bohemian artists, which I believe is your latest work.
It's actually my second one. It's my penultimate.
Your penultimate work. That's perfect. All right. The Battle of Antietam. And he's a 1987 graduate of Rice University in Houston, Texas. And also, we were talking earlier, a survivor of Hurricane Alicia that I also managed to get through when I grew up in Houston. He lives with his wife and twin sons in Forest Hills Gardens, a landmark New York City neighborhood designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., so there's a personal connection there. So if you could all help me, we'd like to welcome Justin Martin to talk about Olmstead.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for that very nice introduction, Andrew. And my speech today is about Frederick Law Olmsted's saddle journey through Texas. See if I can get my first slide. There we go. There's the first slide there. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you Olmsted's entire life story in brief form. He was somebody, he did a lot of different things, and nothing was ever wasted with Olmsted. So something he did would connect to his later endeavors. And in that context, I'm going to focus on his saddle journey through Texas and show how that ultimately would shape and connect to the career he is best known for, which is the pioneer of landscape architecture. So thought it makes sense to begin at the beginning. Olmsted was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1822. This is a monument in downtown Hartford. If you look about the middle of the monument, you can see the name of a couple of Olmsteds. These are forebears of his who were instrumental in founding the community. Now, even as a child, Olmsted developed an appreciation for landscape. In fact, his family, they're in the habit of getting on horseback. Olmsted was just a little guy, so he'd get on the saddle with his father, and they'd travel out into the countryside surrounding Hartford. And they would travel by horseback for hours, and the entire family would be completely silent. Not a word would be spoken, and these would be these reverent appreciations for nature and the natural world. And Olmsted would later look back on this as something that was particularly important in shaping his appreciation for landscape. This particular painting, which I had up here, by the way, is Frederick Church, who was a distant relative of Olmsted's. He lived in Hartford at the same time as Olmsted, and this is actually a painting Church did of the landscape that surrounded Hartford, Connecticut. Now, while Olmsted certainly had an appreciation for nature as a child, he was not a very good student. And so at the age of 14, he dropped out of school, and this meant he was going to have to find a useful profession. And he tried being a surveyor. That didn't really stick. He tried being a clerk in Manhattan. That also didn't really take. So next, Olmsted tried being a sailor. And he took a sailing voyage to China that was to last a year. Now, as the ship was traveling beneath the southern tip of Africa, beneath the Cape of Good Hope, it hit a ferocious storm that almost sunk the ship. Didn't. The ship continued on, and when it docked in China, the captain would not let Olmsted leave the ship. He told him there was a lot of work to be done on this merchant ship that delivered all these goods to China. Olmsted would have to stay on board. He'd have to tar the mast and other busy work and tasks. Finally, the captain relented and let Olmsted, after this long voyage, go on shore for just a few hours to visit China. Then it was the return voyage. Olmsted found that he was always starving, physically exhausted. He discovered that the captain wasn't just emotionally cruel, but also physically cruel and meting out whippings and so forth. When the ship docked after that year-long voyage in Manhattan, when Olmsted disembarked on dry land, he decided never forever to go to sea again. That only meant he's going to have to find another profession. So next, Olmsted lit on being a farmer. And he was better suited to this than many of the things that he had tried. This is actually an old photograph of Olmsted's farm on Staten Island in New York City. Now, while working as a farmer, Olmsted decided to take a walking tour across England. Now, England was the mother country. England was also the seat of scientific farming. So he hoped that maybe he'd see some model farms and get exposed to some novel agricultural practices. Now, when Olmsted returned from England, he was greeted with a really remarkable opportunity. One of his neighbors on Staten Island, where he had his farm, was a man named George Putnam. And Putnam was a publisher. He was a real innovator. He was one of the very first people to publish paperback books. He was selling them for 25 cents a pop. Putnam conscripted Olmsted to write a book about his recent walking tour. And Olmsted wrote that book. It was called Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. Now, this image you see here, this is actually a sketch that Olmsted did during his walking tour that appeared in the book. Now, the book got very lukewarm critical notices. It sold very slowly. But Olmsted had now dipped his toe into yet another profession, writing. And now we find ourselves in the year 1852. There's a brand new newspaper in New York City. It's a startup. It's called the New York Times. It's in a competitive fight for its life. You figure there's about 12 other dailies in New York City at that time, so they're all having a fight and struggle for sales. Now, Henry Raymond, who's the editor of this brand new paper, he decided one way to distinguish the Times from its big field of competitors was to pick a really rich topic. And so he decided to do a series. He wanted to do a series in which he dispatched a reporter to the South to report on slavery. Now, this was 1852, so it was less than a decade before the Civil War broke out. And at this point, the tensions between the North and South were on the rise, tensions that really dated all the way to the inception of the nation. So Olmsted, he applied for this job. He had a 5-minute interview with Henry Raymond, and he landed this gig. You might say, how is that possible? How is he in any way qualified? Well, the New York Times was a startup, so they were in a mode where they were willing to take a risk on someone. But in a way, Olmsted was pretty qualified. He had written a book, albeit not a very brisk seller. He was a farmer by trade, and the South in this era was nothing if not an agrarian society. So late in the autumn of 1852, after the harvest was over, because Olmsted was still a farmer by trade, he set out for the South, and he traveled everywhere. One of his enduring observations that appeared in his New York Times dispatches was he found the southern landscape to be one of remarkable beauty. But per his mandate, he also reported on the conditions of slavery. And he developed a kind of novel notion or theory. One of the things he observed was when he would go to a plantation, he noticed older slaves couldn't work. Younger slaves couldn't work. Also, if a slave claimed to be ill, it was difficult to get that slave to work. How could anybody prove otherwise, and what incentive did any of these slaves have to work? And so he came to the conclusion that at any given time, only about a third of the slaves on a plantation were actually working. And yet the plantation owner had to care for and take care of all of them just the same. What's more, he concluded that a slave that was working was about 50% as efficient as a paid northern employee on a farm. And so Olmsted, he famously, as someone described it, he traveled everywhere, he talked to everyone. He went through Virginia, down through the Carolinas, he went through the Deep South, and he developed this very novel theory on slavery, and it was based on firsthand observation. This was a time when many Northerners were against the institution of slavery, but they had no basis for it other than a feeling. Olmsted provided them with grist with this travel. And he also, with this series of dispatches, he helped put the startup New York Times on the map. So here's a photograph of Olmsted with a group of friends from about that time. And Olmsted is the only one not looking at the camera, fittingly. He's looking off to the side. Behind him is his brother John, his younger brother, who's kind of leaning sideways like this. And John will figure very largely in the action that's about to come. So when Olmsted returned from his first southern swing for the New York Times, he returned to farming, but he'd had a taste of the roving correspondence life, and he wanted to do that again. So he met with Henry Raymond, the editor of the Times, and they batted some ideas around and cooked up a new assignment for Olmsted. This time he was going to return to the South, but he was going to travel across Texas. And Olmsted surmised that doing a series of dispatches on Texas and on slavery in a frontier condition would be very different. He expected it would be quite a contrast from slavery as he's observed it in some of the sort of existing bastions, places where it had existed for generations, like Alabama or Virginia. So that was to be Olmsted's territory, sort of slavery in a frontier environment. This time, his brother was going to accompany him, his brother John. John, his younger brother, was actually suffering from tuberculosis, and one of the regimens that people had in those days was that maybe a person who was suffering from tuberculosis might be able to arrest its progress by doing rigorous outdoor activity. And if one was able to do it in a kind of dry air environment, all the better. Texas seemed very promising in that regard. So in the autumn of 1853, after the harvest was over, because Olmsted was still a farmer by trade, he and his brother set off for this adventure. Now, Olmsted had already been through much of the seaboard states of the South on his earlier journey. He wanted to get right to his destination point, or his jump-off point. So this time he and his brother took trains and other fast conveyances of that era to get right to the Louisiana-Texas border. At that point, the two of them purchased horses. They hired a Texas Ranger to accompany them, and they set off across Texas. Now, once again, as Olmsted was traveling across Texas, one of the things that just really fills up his dispatches are his appreciation, his sense of the remarkable beauty of the landscape. And in fact, this image right here is an illustration that Olmsted did while he was taking his saddle journey through Texas. Of course, his mandate, once again, was to explore the subject of slavery. And Olmsted, while he was traveling with his brother, often they would come to planters' houses, and they would stay with those planters at night. The planters tended to be kind of in straitened circumstances economically. They were happy to take in a boarder. And Olmsted, as you might imagine, was happy to have, this would be a person he could interview, a person he could talk to and look at their operation for the reporting he's doing. And as he was staying with these various planters, he started to refine his theories from his earlier swing through the South. And one of his big observations was he noticed just how close to the bone these planters were living. Even though they were slaveholders, they were really in pretty economically tough circumstances. And one of the things he noticed particularly was what terrible shape a lot of their homes were in. A lot of them had broken glass panes in their windows. The roofs were not repaired. The rain was pouring in. If there was anything manufactured in a house, it tended to be broken. He has a great observation in his book about he saw a clock sitting on the mantelpiece. He recognized the clock as having been manufactured in his home state of Connecticut. The clock was stopped dead. And Olmsted, he started to take this observation and he kind of made a refinement. And he came to the conclusion that what this had to do with was a degradation of work, of course, that was happening due to slavery. Of course, slaves, they didn't like to do any work. They had no incentive. Their time was not their own. But Olmsted felt that in a slave society, work was degraded for everybody, not just the slaves, but for everybody. And so because work was fit only for slaves, nobody was willing or capable of doing much of it. So if your windows broke in your house or your roof was damaged, you weren't inclined to fix it. Neither were you able to find anyone who might fix it. If your clock manufactured in the North broke, you weren't inclined to fix it, and you weren't going to be able to find anybody who could do that. So this was kind of his refinement of his observations he made during his first southern journey. He also noticed, as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of these slaveholders were in really economically straitened circumstances. A lot of them were growing cotton. That was the cash crop. But a lot of them were working their land really hard. They weren't rotating their crops. Another observation Olmsted made was very interesting and kind of amusing was that many of these farmers, many of these planters with slaves, they owned cattle, yet there was never any milk or cheese available. And that was because nobody bothered to do the work of milking the cows. And so this was sort of, as I said, a kind of a refinement of Olmsted's observations from his first tour through the South. And he ascribed it, he felt that slavery led to economic impoverishment. But as a corollary to that, he also started to observe that not only did slavery lead to economic impoverishment, but also to cultural impoverishment. He noticed that many of these slaveholders lived at great remove one from another. And unlike in the northern cities where he was used to, there would be opera houses and museums, places where people could meet and mingle and exchange ideas. These planters lived at such great physical remove that they weren't in the habit of meeting up with anybody and having any kind of free exchange of ideas. Furthermore, they were so hard bitten, they were working so desperately to keep up their plantations that many of them, if they had any free time at all, they did not devote it to any kind of cultural endeavor. He noticed that they didn't tend to have books in their houses, they weren't reading. And as Olmsted famously said, during his southern trip, he never saw a pianoforte, he never saw a work of Shakespeare. Now, this particular leg of Olmsted's journey through Texas, it provided for rich reportage, yet at the same time, in a way, he was not breaking new ground. His mandate had been that he would go to Texas and see if slavery was somehow different in a frontier environment. But really what he was discovering was slavery was slavery. That was his observation. So in a way, he was not breaking new ground with these dispatches. That all changed when Olmsted and his brother crossed the Guadalupe River. There, as they entered into West Texas, into the hill country, they started to meet and come across German settlers who were farmers. Now, these German settlers were free soilers, almost to a one. They did not own slaves. And he immediately noticed that they had model farms. Many of these farms, the windows and the roofs were in good shape. They certainly weren't going to, if a window or roof was damaged, they were going to take care of it. They actually, working the farms themselves, they put a premium. They extolled the virtues of work, these German farmers. He also noticed that although cotton is certainly a lucrative crop, and many of them were growing cotton, they were also taking care of their land, rotating the crops, planting other things other than cotton. Many of them also had their own plots in which they were growing various vegetables for their own consumption. So he saw that certainly they were living, although they did not have the benefit of slave labor, in fact they abhorred it, they're actually in better economic circumstances than the planters he had encountered who were slaveholders earlier in his trip. He also, as he started visiting these Texas Germans, he became very quickly aware of what rich cultural lives they led. They did have free time, and in their free time they felt inclined to get together, to share the news of the day. He'd go over to one of these one of these German farmers' homes, and perhaps there would be a piano there. Someone might strike up a piano and people would start singing. They might sing, they might play music from Mozart. We'd visit people's houses. He noticed they had lithographs on the wall, paintings on the wall. They had many books on their bookshelves. He also, to his great amusement, noticed that when he was served food, the food tended to be delicious and varied. And I'm now going to read a brief excerpt from Olmsted's own account of his travels through Texas, a very brief excerpt which describes Olmsted stopping at a German run-in and how it contrasted with some of the planter run-ins that he'd stayed in earlier. So he says, "I never in my life, except perhaps an awakening from a dream, met with such a sudden and complete transfer of associations. Instead of loose boarded or hewn log walls, with crevices stuffed with rags or daubed with mortar, which we have been accustomed to see during the last month, we were, in short, we were in Germany. The landlady enters. She does not readily understand us, and one of the smokers rises immediately to assist us. Dinner we shall have immediately, and she spreads the white cloth at the end of the table before she leaves the room. And in 2 minutes' time, by which we have got off our coats and warmed our hands on the stove, we are asked to sit down. An excellent soup is set before us, and in succession there follow 2 courses of meat, neither of them pork, and neither of them fried, 2 dishes of vegetables, salad, compoted peaches, coffee with milk, wheat bread from the loaf, and beautiful and sweet butter. Not only such butter as I have never tasted south of the Potomac before, but such that I have been told 100 times it was impossible to make in a southern climate. We then spent an hour in conversation with the gentlemen who were in the room. They were all educated, cultivated, well-bred, respectful, kind, and affable men. All were natives of Germany and had been living several years in Texas. So Olmsted, he'd found his territory. His territory for this second series of dispatches was going to be about the contrast between the hard-bitten planters he'd encountered, particularly in East Texas, that held slaves, and the free soil German farmers he was encountering here. And as was Olmsted's wont, he went all over the hill country. He visited New Braunfels, which this old image is an image of. He visited what are called the Latin communities, Sisterdale and Bettina. He also visited San Antonio, and he found it to be an amazingly, remarkably cosmopolitan city. This is actually a painting that's in the Witte's collection, which is by a German painter, and it's from about the same time of Olmsted's visits by a painter, I believe his name was Henry Lungwitz. So Olmsted, he traveled all over Texas, as you can see, and had another landmark series of dispatches from the New York Times, which helped put this new paper on the map. Now, when Olmsted returned to New York, one transformation he'd gone through was he was now an abolitionist. Before he'd left, he'd been against slavery, as many people, North and South, were. But it was based partly on his kind of novel economic theory, and it was also just based on a sort of a feeling. But now he felt that slavery was a moral blight. And when he returned to New York City, when he'd been in the hill country, he'd met a man named Adolph Douai. That's his photograph right there. And Douai was the publisher of a German language paper that just railed against slavery. Olmsted, among his friends and associates in New York City, raised $200 to help Douai with his newspaper. Olmsted, as a budding abolitionist, also raised money to purchase a cannon, which was shipped off to Kansas to help the Free Soilers there in their efforts to stave off. There were people coming in trying to ensure that Kansas, when it went from being a territory to a state, would be a slave state. The Free Soilers were trying to fight them off. This cannon was designed for that purpose, and Olmsted, who'd been exposed to Free Soilers in the case of the Germans in Texas, felt very sympathetic to the cause of what would come to be known as Bleeding Kansas. So now we're in 1857. Olmsted is actually writing a book about his travels for the New York Times through the South. It's also a terrible year for the United States economically. It is a very rapid economic downward spiral. Olmsted, he has holes in his shoes. He is low on coal. He owes money to almost everyone he knows. And so he feels like he's going to have to take a job. And so he takes a job that was a very modest job. It was to be the superintendent in charge of clearing a piece of land that was very prosaically named for its place right in the middle of New York City. It was called Central Park, and Olmsted's very modest job was to clear this scruffy piece of land and knock down shanties and drain swamps and prepare it for somebody else's design. Enter Calvert Vaux. Now, Vaux was an English-trained architect. He took one look at the existing design for Central Park and he was disgusted. He could not believe how amateurish it was. And Vaux had friends in high places. He knew some members of the Central Park board. And so he started approaching the board and he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, in England, where I'm from, if you want the best design, you have a public design competition. How about let's scrap this terrible amateurish design and have a public design competition to try to get a new design. Well, the board had listened to Vaux. It scrapped that existing amateurish design, and it announced a public design competition. At this point, Vaux sought out Olmsted to be his partner for the public design competition. Now, Vaux was aware that Olmsted had a profile as a writer for the New York Times who'd done this landmark swing through the South, but that didn't really interest Vaux for these purposes. The reason Vaux sought out Olmsted was because Olmsted had been out on this scruffy piece of land, knocking down shanties and draining swamps, and Vaux perceived that Olmsted literally knew the lay of the land. So Vaux and Olmsted teamed up, and all of a sudden, Olmsted is involved in a new endeavor. He's designing a park, but in a way he'd been apprenticing for this his entire life. He and Vaux teamed up, and Olmsted brought brilliant ideas to this plan. This is actually the actual blueprint, which is 10 feet long by 3 feet tall, that Olmsted and Vaux did for Central Park. Olmsted brought brilliant ideas, as did his partner Vaux. The board instantly recognized this was the design for Central Park. It was an A+ design. Many of the other designs deserve merit a flat F, if that. And so this was adopted as the design. Suddenly Olmsted finds himself designing a public park. Now, one of the hallmarks of Central Park was that Olmsted, you might almost call it landscape engineering. Olmsted contrived to create situations in which people subtly, without even realizing it, were guided to come together and to mix and to mingle. He based this notion of trying to bring people from different backgrounds together to mix and mingle in his park creation. He based this as based on a cautionary tale, having seen the cultural remove that the planters had lived in, the slaveholding planters, and how they had no cultural commerce. He also based it on the positive tale of having seen the Texas Germans and seen how they got together and collaborated and shared culture. And so this was kind of landscape engineering designed to bring people together. And as Olmsted himself would say of Central Park, he described it as a democratic achievement of the highest significance. Now, Central Park was a massive public works project, and it was partway done. It was going to take many years to get done, but it was off and rolling, you might describe it as, when in 1861 the Civil War broke out. Now, Olmsted, he certainly wanted to be involved. He wanted to be involved on the Union side. So he traveled down to Washington, D.C., and he headed up a unit called the United States Sanitary Commission that just provided immeasurable aid to wounded soldiers during the Civil War. And after the Civil War, through a whole series of convolutions, the United States Sanitary Commission, this very outfit that Olmsted headed up, would morph into the American Red Cross. But I think I've established by now that Olmsted was a pretty restless guy. So about halfway through the Civil War, he perceived that the United States Sanitary Commission was on even footing, and so he decided to try something else. He headed out to California to become the superintendent of a gold mine. Now, this gold mine was an ugly piece of land that was being worked tirelessly, trying to extract gold from the ground. Now, I inset a stock certificate. If you're able to find a collector, as I did, you might be able to get a stock certificate like that for $5, or I think I paid $7 for that. In Olmsted's day, a stock certificate like that would have been worth $0. It was no. This mine was a bust. Very little gold was ever found. However, I'm going to tell you now that Olmsted's middle name was Law. So his name was Frederick Law Olmsted. More fittingly, his middle name probably should have been Serendipity. It really would have been the right name for him, because while he was working in this gold mine, about 30 miles away was Yosemite Valley. And Olmsted started visiting repeatedly, and he was just enchanted. And according to one old account I came across, Olmsted was one of the very first 500 non-Native Americans to even enter Yosemite. Gives you an idea of how isolated it was in this era. But Olmsted instantly perceived that over time, Yosemite would become a real destination. And he wrote a kind of manifesto. And one of the things he said in his manifesto was, before long, millions of people a year will be visiting Yosemite. This is so incredibly prescient to have written this in the 1860s. As part of his manifesto, furthermore, he called upon the federal government to step in and preserve this natural wonder for posterity. Now, at this time, when there were preservation efforts in the United States, they tended to be undertaken by private interests. Like, let's say there's some kind of natural wonder, often a steamship company that was conveying people to the natural wonder. They'd take care of it because it suited their purposes. If they took good care of it, they could continue to convey people by steamship to see it. But Olmsted was actually making this novel suggestion that the federal government should be the one to step in and be charged with taking care of a natural wonder such as Yosemite. And in a way, Olmsted should correctly be credited with sort of setting in motion something that kind of ricocheted or echoed through the culture for several decades, this notion of a National Park Service, which ultimately would be created, several decades after Olmsted's hue and cry. Well, the Civil War ended in 1865, and all of these communities, both north and south, they had a pent-up desire for parks. They'd put their civic plans on hold during the Civil War. Now there was a real upsurge in activity. And Olmsted, of course, he had an unbelievable calling card with Central Park. And so all of a sudden he starts getting approached. And so in late middle age, Olmsted finally settled into the career he would be remembered for by posterity. He designed a whole series of parks and landscape creations across the country. He designed Prospect Park in Brooklyn. I love this image. It's like some kind of tree trimming team on a very precarious ladder. He designed a whole series of parks for Boston, known as the Emerald Necklace. He didn't just design parks; he designed all kinds of landscapes. And one notable one was the grounds of the Columbia Exposition, a World's Fair. It was a temporary landscape that he'd set up for a World's Fair. But with all of Olmsted's projects, landscape projects, one of his hallmarks would continue to be a desire to do that landscape engineering, to push people together in subtle ways they might not even notice as a visitor to one of his creations like that. Push people together so that they exchange ideas and culture. And that, of course, was born. It had long ago roots in his trip through Texas. So I'm now going to close by showing everyone just a series. Everything I've shown you to this point have been vintage images of either Olmsted or some of his creations. I'm going to close by showing you some modern images. And hopefully by showing you some Technicolor pictures, it'll show people what good condition so many of his creations continue to be in. I'm not going to provide a lot of commentary for these slides. I'll just sort of walk through them, a slideshow of Olmsted's landscape creations as they currently stand. So Olmsted, he designed the grounds of the U.S. Capitol in 1874, if I remember correctly, and this modern aerial shot shows you how true that design still is today. Olmsted designed the campus of Stanford University. This is Belle Isle, an island park in Detroit, Michigan. This is the Druid Hills neighborhood in Atlanta. This is the 99 Steps, a feature of Franklin Park, one of the Boston parks that Olmsted designed. Presque Isle in Marquette, Michigan. Lake Park in Milwaukee. Yes, Olmsted designed the grounds of the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. Olmsted and his then partner Vaux. This is Delaware Park, just a jewel of an entire park system in Buffalo, New York, designed by Olmsted and then partner Vaux. Shawnee Park, absolutely gorgeous park in Louisville, Kentucky. I thought given the warm weather here in San Antonio, people would enjoy a winter scene in New York, in Central Park. And finally, for Olmsted, his swan song, the last major project he did during his career, the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. So I just wanted to close by saying that it's wonderful that Olmsted's vivid democratic vision, born in large part through his saddle journey through Texas, is still so very much alive and with us today. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. You hit the nail on the head. Yes, his father was a very well-to-do merchant, and also, unlike fathers in that era, a real softy, I guess is the best way to put it. He had a real soft spot for Frederick, and Frederick was always hitting him up for money and always coming up with schemes. One of the best schemes was he settles down. He finally appears to settle down. It's sort of he was not being such a boomerang child, that used the modern parlance, finally settling down to becoming a farmer. Must have made his father feel relieved. His father isn't having to foot the bill for all these different. And then he writes to his father and says, "I'm really enjoying being a farmer, but I could be a better farmer if I could take a walking trip across England. And I just need, if you could just lend me, $500 or whatever it was at the time, it would be repaid thousandfold by my knowledge as a farmer." And Olmsted kept that up until even long past what many modern kids do. It was probably about his 40s when he finally really took root as a landscape architect and started actually being able to fully pay his own way. So yes, he came from a privileged background from the standpoint that his father was very successful and his father took care of him. He did survive to see his son. His father died, if I remember right, about in the 1870s, about the time he designed two major projects for Olmsted, the Capitol grounds and also Montreal, the park in Montreal. He'd already done Prospect Park and Central Park and Riverside in Chicago. And so his father lived to see Olmsted be a successful and also fully actualized and fully self-supporting landscape architect. Yes, sir. Was your question whether he commented on the ones that had come over from the revolutions? And absolutely. In fact, Olmsted made a very discerning distinction, which, based on his on-the-ground reporting, between, I think, what were called the 48ers, who often tended to be, these were people who'd left Germany often for political reasons, and some of them were very, they might be politicians, they might be doctors, lawyers, what have you, and they tended to be very fervent, you might call them moral abolitionists. But Olmsted also made the very interesting observation that though you had the 48ers, you also had other just free soil German farmers who weren't 48ers, but they were also very, very averse to slavery. They might not have the same, sort of philosophical, moral description of it. It might be more just sort of a simple a feeling that slavery was wrong, and also a feeling that work is honorable, and that they want to do their own work, basically. And so he made a lot of comments on just the general temper of the German settlers in West Texas, but also making the distinction between what he called the 48ers and just the general free soil German farmers. Yes, ma'am. He didn't. You would think that that maybe, yeah. As far as it's sort of like one of those proving a negative things, but certainly in all of the the correspondence and so forth, that he was pretty voluminous about. He makes no reference to Muir or vice versa. So it appears the two, although they would have had lots in common, it appears they did not meet. Yes, sir. What were some of the design techniques that he? Yeah, a lot of what he used was he thought a lot about how sort of getting people to move through spaces in ways that they would not be even aware that they were doing. And I'll give a good example. My wife grew up in Rochester, New York, right across the street from this park called Highland Park. And Highland Park is a good example of an Olmsted concept called passages of scenery. And the idea of passages of scenery is, you might, in the case of Highland Park, he created a series of rooms out of trees. And so basically you'd have a room that had a doorway, which was just a gap, and then you'd have trees planted almost like a wall, like making this shape. and then you have another gap somewhere, and it would be another doorway leading into another room. And these trees might be different. It might be a room of elms, so all the walls are formed by elms standing close to each other. Another room might be a room of conifers, and you're moving through the. My wife told me as a little girl, she goes, we'd get on our sleds and we'd go through these gaps between the trees, and we'd go, and then we'd end up in this room, and she didn't call them rooms. She just said we'd end up here. I thought, here it was 100 years after Olmsted even designed the park, and my wife was, as a user of the park, doing what she wanted him to do without even being aware. It's just natural. You see a gap, you go through the gap, you get led ultimately into another space. And so he had lots of masterful. Another thing he would always do is like Central Park, he had diagonals that just drove people. One of his ideas was, you're trying to get people out of the city. So why not have people, it's a tall, skinny park, a very kind of bad shape for a park. Why not people have diagonals that quickly drive people? If they're trying to forget the city, they'll diagonal paths that'll quickly drive them right into a meadow in the center of the park, where they'll now be separated from the city, and they'll now be around other people who've taken these same diagonals that lead to this meadow, and they'll gather there, and they'll gather away from the city. And so in an era long, long before cell phones and other things existed, he had this idea that, if people are finding distraction in the city, let's use these diagonal pathways to very, very quickly get them out of the city and into common spaces where they can mix and mingle in this kind of democratic way. So, yes, ma'am. Great question. He was very familiar with Capability Brown particularly being an actual landscape architect at a time when certainly nobody in America prior to Olmsted really could have, a few people could, but could have really taken on that mantle. And so, yeah, Capability Brown, as so often happens with in those days in America, there were European or English forebears, artistic, and Capability Brown was a very formidable, accomplished model that Olmsted was quite aware of. Yes, sir. I haven't. Did you say that you said he designed a park here in San Antonio called San Pedro Park? I haven't come across plans, but the amazing thing to me about Olmsted is he worked in the 19th century, pre-airplane, pre-cell phone, pre-car, and the places he got to and the amount of designs he did it's just outrageous. I have this book that's almost as thick as a phone book, which is just a list of his various designs he did. And then if you go to a place called Fairstead, which was his home office in Boston, they actually have, it's an amazing resource for someone who's a landscape architect. In my case, I'm a writer, so I didn't go and look at these plans, but for a landscape architect, they could actually go and look at the original plans for all of his thousands of creations across the country. And I have no doubt that the plans for San Pedro Park must be the actual original blueprint, and temperature controlled and nicely stored and well cared for. I have no doubt is at Fairstead for to be viewed and by landscape architects who want to take a look at these plans. Yes, sir. Yeah, he and Vaux did quite a bit of work together. After what happened was he and Vaux worked together up until I think the early 1870s. So they did Central Park together, then they did Prospect Park in Brooklyn. They did some parks in Chicago, and they also did Riverside Park, and they also did a park system for the city of Buffalo. But Vaux and Olmsted almost always got along terrible. They were really at each other's throats. Vaux was about 4'10", and Olmsted was actually fairly small too. But the two of them, I always picture these as little tiny guys who just went at it, and they really, even going back to Central Park, they'd ride over the grounds of Central Park on horseback, and then they'd go back to Vaux's apartment and just argue all night long. And they didn't get along well. And one of their main areas of clash was Vaux was a true artist, and so he believed you create a beautiful work of art, something looks beautiful as a design, you've sort of done your job. Olmsted was what you might call a practical artist, particularly all the experiences he's had. So like Olmsted was a very good writer, so he recognized, okay, you've created a park plan for a big city. You're nowhere near done. I mean, this is a big city. It's going to have, there are going to be people in the public, the board of the park, that are going to weigh in. They're going to want to, so Olmsted was always Vaux would be like, my job is done. And Olmsted would say, your job isn't done. The people in this community are complaining that they don't believe that this can be done, or they don't like this feature. We're going to have to go back to the drawing board. Olmsted, because he was a journalist by training, he often would sometimes, he would place an op-ed, as it were, to use the modern, arguing for his, an anonymous op-ed would appear in the paper, one of his journalist buddies arguing for his vision of the park. So you might say Olmsted was a man of the, he also gave a lot of thought to sewage, which is a boring topic, but you don't want your park to be all swampy. And so because he'd been a farmer, he knew a lot about the latest and greatest thinking about drainage. And so, the best way to describe it, Vaux and Olmsted, little guys always clashing over Vaux being a kind of pure artist, Olmsted being a practical artist who recognized that these things were never finished. They had to be fought out, on the public stage and so forth. So their partnership broke up in the early 1870s, although they'd worked together a few times in the following years. And Olmsted, in my speech, I described Vaux as being a trained architect. That's very important. Olmsted was not a trained architect, and parks need bridges and various structures. So Olmsted would always have someone in the Vaux role, a trained architect he'd work with as a partner in any park that he worked in, even after Vaux, who could design a bridge or design some kind of structure, a field house, what have you, that might be in a park. Yes, sir. There's always a lot of information, and apologies, I actually don't know much about it. It always amazes me how many projects he's involved in, and adding to to sort of the confusion is not only did you have Olmsted did his first design, Central Park, in 1857. He did his last project, which was the Biltmore Estate, in 1895. And then his son, Frederick Olmsted Jr., took over. Frederick Olmsted Jr., his working years were basically 1895 to 1957. So you have Olmsted starts in 1857, Frederick Olmsted Jr. Ends in 1957, and as a little professional touch, he didn't use the junior. So as far as you can tell, there appears to be a man working at the top of his game from 1857 to 1957. It's actually father and son. And so they get a lot of work done. And so to return to your original question, one of the multitude of projects I have sadly no familiarity with is the one you described, designing, although there's a lot of campus work done by both Olmsted and Olmsted, his son, Junior. I'm not familiar with that. The good thing is, these projects tended to be very documented because you've always got a board of some kind writing saying, we'd like to engage you, but can you send us a preliminary design? Please come and visit. Tell us what you think. So you've got a lot of back and forth. At any time when I was writing my book, I focused on some of his best known designs like Central Park or the Biltmore Estate or what have you. And there's a remarkable amount for any project. There tends to be a remarkable amount of back and forth discussion about, well, I suggest doing this, and then a board might weigh in and say, well, that doesn't sound right. And then, of course, there would ultimately be a series of blueprints, also because Olmsted was a writer. He'd often accompany him with a written explanation of what he was trying to achieve. And all that stuff is still with us, fortunately. So, yes, ma'am. They were actually designed in that involved early on. It was certainly a kind of both of them being from New York City. It was a nearby natural wonder that was under siege. I mean, people were building all these factories and also amusements and things, And Vaux was actually friends with a lot of the Hudson River School painters, and Niagara Falls was a Hudson River School subject. So Vaux and Olmsted were both kind of casually involved, as in it was something they were aware of, it was something they were advocating for from early in their careers. Late in life, they actually were asked by New York State to actually do a project in which they would remove some of these, like, just ridiculous signs that were obscuring, advertisements that were obscuring the falls and so forth. So they actually embarked on a project, late career for both of them, in which they came back together and came up with a design for both getting rid of some of the unsightly stuff and also just creating a series of pathways and things that would be sensible, that would allow people to find various vistas to overlook the falls. Yes, sir. Brother John with tuberculosis is a very sad story. John died a few years later after the saddle trip across Texas. I always, when I read the book, I found it remarkable. Here was this, his brother was a doctor, so he certainly knew what he was suffering from. I found it remarkable. I don't know much about tuberculosis, but I can't imagine a vigorous saddle trip across Texas can't be, but he made it, and he seemed to, he was. Not only did he make it, but I'll tell you an interesting detail. He then returned to the farm, and Olmsted was actually involved in some other endeavors, and his brother actually ghost wrote, although Olmsted had the byline, the Saddle Journey book, which I think you'd said, sort of in the back that you'd read, probably other people have too, that's actually half written by his brother. And it's interesting because his brother was back on the farm at that point in Staten Island, and Olmsted was then able, so Olmsted wrote 3 separate books about each of his southern trips, and then a book that was kind of called The Cotton Kingdom, which was kind of a condensation of he turned them out in rapid order. It seems almost inhuman he could have done it. Well, part of the reason he was able to write 2 700-page books in the space of a year is because his brother wrote half of the Texas Journey. But so Brother John, he returned to Staten Island for a while. His tuberculosis continued to progress. And then he tried going to a variety of different, he had a kind of, I think this was a common thing in those days, kind of a desperate trying different settings. He went to Cuba, he went to Switzerland, and he went to Italy. 3 different places with, I guess, different that were recommended as places where you might be able to arrest the progress of the disease. And so about, if I remember correctly, sadly about 5 years after that saddle trip journey, his brother died. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed that.